It's September 14th, 1914. The German war machine, the most feared military force on the planet, has ground to a halt. The grand strategy for a swift 6-week victory over France, the famous Schlieffen Plan, lies in ruins on the banks of the River Marne. In the opulent German Supreme Headquarters, a man is having a breakdown. General Helmut von Moltke the Younger, the nephew of a military legend, is suffering from a complete nervous collapse. Kaiser Wilhelm II needs a replacement, and he needs one now. He needs a man with ice in his veins, someone to take control of a war that has in just over a month gone catastrophically, terrifyingly wrong. Now, the man he chooses isn't a celebrated field commander. He's not a hero fresh from the front. He's the Prussian Minister for War, a cool, intelligent, and politically astute general named Erich von Falkenhayn. On this September day, Falkenhayn inherits not a plan for victory, but a crisis of survival. The dream of a short, glorious war is dead. The long, grinding reality of trench warfare is being born in the mud of northern France. Erich von Falkenhayn would become one of the most pivotal and polarizing figures of the entire Great War. He's a man who, unlike many of his contemporaries, quickly grasped the new, brutal arithmetic of industrialized warfare. But his attempt to master this new form of conflict would lead him to conceive one of history's most horrific battles, Verdun. And it would forever link his name with the chilling concept of bleeding an enemy to death. This is the story of a modern strategist trapped in a war of unprecedented scale and the catastrophic gamble he made to win that war. To understand the man who would make such a gamble, we have to look beyond the trenches of France, to a career path that was anything but typical for a Prussian general. Erich von Falkenhayn was born in 1861 into an aristocratic but an impoverished Junker family in West Prussia, a world where military service was the highest of callings. He followed the prescribed path, entering a cadet school at the tender age of 11 and becoming an officer by 19. But in 1896, his career took a sharp, unconventional turn. He took a leave of absence from the German army and traveled to the Far East to serve as a military consultant to China's Qing dynasty. At the time, it was rumored he was fleeing gambling debts, but the reality was much more pragmatic than that. It was a move for better pay and faster career advancement, and was undertaken with the full blessing of Kaiser Wilhelm II. His time in Asia culminated in active service during the Boxer Rebellion in 1900, where he served on the staff of the German Expeditionary Forces commander, Alfred von Waldersee. It was here, far from the rigid confines of the Prussian general staff, that Falkenhayn first made his name. His detailed reports and dispatches from the conflict caught the attention of the Kaiser and his brother, Prince Heinrich. They saw in him a capable, open-minded officer with a global perspective. This imperial favor became the rocket fuel for his career. Now, on return to Germany, he enjoyed what one historian called a comet-like ascent, and eventually became one of the military instructors for the Crown Prince himself. This experience abroad set him apart. In an officer corps that was often parochial and insular, Falkenhayn had seen the world. He wasn't a pure product of the general staff system, which explains both his rapid rise through the patronage and the suspicion with which he was often viewed by more traditional military types. His power base wasn't his peers, but the throne. By 1913, he had reached the pinnacle of the military political establishment in his appointment as the Prussian Minister of War. And in that role, he was responsible for the Army's equipment and logistics, and he greatly improved the systems for munitions supply and troop transport by rail. These were skills that would prove vital in the coming Great War. During the July crisis in the summer of 1914, Falkenhayn was a key war hawk in Berlin, He embraced the idea of war with enthusiasm, pushing for an early mobilization and even pressuring a Kaiser who was having some last-minute doubts. In a statement that captured the fatalistic mood of the European military elite, he told the German chancellor, quote, "Even if we perish over this, it will still have been worth it," end quote. When Moltke faltered after the Battle of the Marne, the Kaiser turned to the man he knew and trusted, the cool, decisive war minister who had promised him the army was ready. Upon taking command, Falkenhayn immediately faced a strategic dilemma that would define his entire tenure and create a bitter rift within the German high command. The war was no longer a single decisive campaign in the West. It was now a two-front struggle against the combined might of Russia, France, and the British Empire. The central question for the German army was this: where should we focus our efforts? Falkenhayn was the leading proponent of the West Ender philosophy. He was convinced that the war would be won or lost in France. He identified Britain with its global empire and naval power as Germany's true ultimate enemy. To defeat Britain, he reasoned, Germany would first have to knock its essential continental ally, France, out of the war. Russia, in his view, was a secondary problem. He argued that its sheer size made a decisive victory there nearly impossible. The Russian army could always retreat into its vast interior, swallowing German armies without a final conclusive battle, much like they did to Napoleon 100 years earlier. As early as November 1914, Falkenhayn recognized that a total victory was unlikely and advocated seeking a separate, negotiated peace with the Tsar to free up all of Germany's strength for the Western Front. This view put him in direct conflict with the heroes of the hour, General Paul von Hindenburg and his brilliant but sometimes volatile chief of staff, Erich Ludendorff. As commanders of Oberost, the German high command on the Eastern Front, they had just won a stunning victory against the Russians at the Battle of Tannenberg. They became figureheads of the East Ender faction, arguing that Russia was the more immediate threat and could be knocked out of the war with a single massive offensive. Now, this disagreement wasn't just professional, it was deeply personal and political. Hindenburg and Ludendorff accused Falkenhayn of starving their front of reinforcements out of jealousy over their success. They claimed he was sabotaging their chance for a war-winning victory. So they began actively scheming against him, lobbying the chancellor and even members of the imperial family for his removal. This clash of philosophies, Falkenhayn's cold realism versus the Easterners' belief in the traditional Prussian doctrine of a decisive battle of annihilation, became the central power struggle of the German war effort. Falkenhayn's campaigns in 1915 need to be viewed through this lens. When he did shift forces to the east, it wasn't a concession to the Easterners' strategy, but an act of strategic triage. The Gorlice-Tarnow offensive in May 1915 was launched primarily because the Austro-Hungarian army was on the verge of complete collapse under Russian pressure. The chief of staff of the Austro-Hungarian army, Konrad von Hötzendorf, had gone so far as to threaten a separate peace if Germany didn't help. The offensive was a spectacular success, stabilizing Germany's key ally and driving the Russians out of Poland. But for Falkenhayn, it only proved his point. Despite this huge tactical victory, Russia remained in the war. Later that year, he orchestrated a swift and complete triumph over Serbia, securing the Balkans and opening a supply line to the Ottoman Empire. With his eastern flank temporarily secure, he could now turn his full attention back to his primary objective, breaking the stalemate in the West. By late 1915, Falkenhayn had developed a plan for the following year. It was a plan born of a grim realization. In the face of machine guns, barbed wire, and massed artillery, the old ways of war were obsolete. A decisive breakthrough on the Western Front was a bloody illusion. If Germany couldn't win the war by maneuver, he concluded, it would have to win by a different, more terrible logic: attrition. His new strategy, which he codenamed Unternehmen Gericht, or Operation Judgment, was based on a radical and terrifying concept. The goal was not to capture territory, but to kill so many enemy soldiers that their nation's will to fight would collapse. His infamous phrase for this, which was really only applied in retrospect, was to bleed the French army white. The target he selected was the ancient fortress city of Verdun. Falkenhayn chose Verdun not for strategic importance, which was somewhat limited, but for its immense symbolic and psychological value for the French people. It was a place of national pride, a bastion they couldn't afford to lose. Falkenhayn gambled that the French would be honor-bound to defend it to the last man, pouring its strategic reserve into the fight. The German plan was to seize the heights on the east bank of the Meuse River, which overlooked the city. Now, from these dominant positions, German heavy artillery would act as a giant Meuse mill, systematically grinding the French army to dust as it launched desperate, futile counterattacks. It was a plan to weaponize French patriotism against itself. This strategy represents a profound and chilling intellectual leap in the history of warfare. It was arguably the first time a major army commander deliberately designed a battle not to achieve a decisive victory on the battlefield, but to function as an industrial-scale killing machine, aimed at producing a demographic and psychological collapse. But it should be noted that the very existence of this plan is a subject of intense historical debate. In his memoirs written after the war, Falkenhayn claimed that this was his intention all along, outlining it in a so-called Christmas memorandum to the Kaiser in late 1915. But this document has never been found. Many historians, particularly in the post-war era, concluded that it was a fabrication, an attempt by Falkenhayn to justify a conventional offensive that had simply failed to achieve a breakthrough. They point to orders given to the commanders on the ground, such as Crown Prince Wilhelm, which spoke of capturing the fortress, not just killing Frenchmen. But more recent scholarship suggests that the attrition goal was very real, even if it was never formalized in a single document. Falkenhayn was wary of leaks, and he preferred to communicate his complex and gruesome ideas verbally rather than in written orders. The fatal flaw may have been a disconnect between his radical new strategy conceived at the highest levels and the traditional territory-focused mindset of the commanders who were tasked with executing it on the ground. They understood how to take a hill. The concept of using a battle as a pump to exsanguinate the enemy was alien to their entire military education. The bottom line is we'll probably never know for sure. The Battle of Verdun began on February 21st, 1916. For 9 hours, over 1,200 German guns subjected the French lines to a bombardment of an intensity the world had never before witnessed. In the first days, the German advance was successful, capturing key positions like Fort Douaumont. But the breakthrough Falkenhayn's subordinates hoped for was never realized. Instead, the battle quickly devolved into the very thing he had theorized, a mutual, grinding slaughterhouse. Falkenhayn had made two critical miscalculations. He had fatally underestimated the resilience of the French army, and he had vastly overestimated his own army's ability to inflict casualties without also suffering grievous casualties in return. The French, under the brilliant command of General Philippe Pétain, organized a masterful defense. They established a lifeline into the city, a single road that became known as the Voie Sacrée, or the Sacred Way. Along this road, they rotated fresh divisions into the line and pulled out exhausted ones, ensuring that no single unit was bled white and that the front would never break. The Germans found themselves drawn deeper and deeper into the very meat grinder they had designed for the French. To maintain pressure on the defenders, German troops had to attack, exposing themselves to the same hell of shellfire and machine guns. The Meuse mill was chewing up both armies with terrifying impartiality. The butcher's bill for the 10-month battle was staggering. The French suffered over 370,000 casualties, and the Germans around 330,000. The battle had become a symbol of the war's senseless, attritional horror. I've been to the Verdun battlefield, and I have to tell you that it's one of those places on Earth where you immediately feel the weight of the history that happened there. Unlike battlefields like the Somme or Ypres or other places on the Western Front, Verdun largely still looks the same because so much of the terrain was in remote areas that were so devastated they could never be reoccupied. There are these villages such as Fleury that are known as villages that died for France, mort pour la France. And they still have a mayor, even though no one lives there. And you can walk around Fleury, which is right by Fort Douaumont, and you can see the shell holes, the craters everywhere, and you can see where the baker lived and where the farmers lived and where people whose homes and town were destroyed forever once tried to survive in the midst of this awful, awful place. And then you go to a place like the Douaumont ossuary, which is this giant bone-containing building with the bones of over 100,000 Germans and French and other soldiers. And you can look into the windows and you can stare face to face into the skull of one of the men who died during this meat grinder of a battle in 1916. It is overwhelming, and it's tough to process. And I would encourage you, if you use YouTube, check out my YouTube channel, Stories of the Great War. I actually visited some of these sites on the Verdun battlefield. You can see them for yourself. As for Falkenhayn and the Germans, strategically, Verdun did have a massive impact. It succeeded in tying down the French army, which forced the British to launch their own major offensive on the Somme earlier than planned, and primarily with British troops rather than an equal joint British-French offensive. And this was done partially to relieve the pressure on Verdun. But it didn't break the French will to fight. If anything, it hardened it. For Germany, the immense losses of veteran soldiers and junior officers at Verdun were crippling. The battle shattered Falkenhayn's prestige and exposed the fundamental flaw in his theory. Once started, the horrific logic of attrition, the idea that the immense sacrifices already made demand even more sacrifices to be justified, made the battle almost impossible to stop. It's the sunk cost fallacy. Falkenhayn, the cold-blooded theorist, had become a victim of his own creation's inexorable, inhuman momentum. His unwillingness to call off the offensive sooner was seen as his greatest leadership failure. By August of 1916, Erich von Falkenhayn's position as chief of the general staff was untenable. The bloody stalemate at Verdun was now compounded by crises on all fronts. The British were hammering the German lines on the Somme. The Russians had launched the massive and unexpectedly successful Brusilov offensive in the east, and the Italians were launching yet another assault on the Isonzo River. The final straw came on August 27th when Romania, believing the Central Powers were on the ropes, declared war and invaded Transylvania, opening a dangerous new front in the Balkans. The Kaiser had lost all faith. On August 29, 1916, he dismissed Falkenhayn and appointed the popular heroes of the Eastern Front, Hindenburg and Ludendorff, to supreme command. It seemed like the end of Falkenhayn's career, a disgraceful demotion. He was given command of the newly formed Ninth Army, tasked with dealing with the new Romanian threat. But here, freed from the immense political and strategic burdens of high command, something remarkable happened. Falkenhayn, the failed grand strategist, proved himself to be a masterful field commander. He executed a brilliant, lightning-fast campaign of maneuver that stands in stark contrast to the static slaughter of Verdun. His first move was to counter the Romanian invasion of Transylvania. At the Battle of the Red Tower Pass in late September, his forces, including the elite German Alpine Corps, executed a bold flanking maneuver through the mountains the Romanians had considered impassable, trapping and mauling the Romanian First Army. Having driven the invaders out, Falkenhayn now pushed his own army through the Carpathian passes into Romania itself. His Ninth Army linked up with another Central Powers force under General August von Mackensen advancing from the south. On December 6, 1916, their combined forces marched into the Romanian capital of Bucharest. In less than 4 months, Romania had been decisively defeated. The Romanian campaign is the great paradox of Falkenhayn's career. It reveals a completely different general, bold, decisive, and highly competent in a war of movement. Now that forces us to ask a difficult question. Was he a brilliant general who was simply a poor grand strategist? Or was his failure at Verdun the result of an impossible strategic situation that no one could have solved? Falkenhayn's final major command took him even further from the Western Front. In 1917, he was sent to the Middle East to command a joint Ottoman-German army group in Palestine. The mission was a daunting one: to halt the relentless advance of the superior British-Egyptian expeditionary force, commanded by the very capable General Edmund Allenby. Here, there would be no redemption. Facing a numerically and materially superior enemy, Falkenhayn's forces were outmatched. He suffered a series of defeats, culminating in the loss of Gaza, the vital wells at Beersheba, and finally the city of Jerusalem in December 1917. He was relieved of command in February 1918 and spent the final months of the war in an obscure administrative post in Lithuania before retiring. But his time in Palestine contains one final surprising footnote. Amidst the military defeats, he performed a significant humanitarian act. He actively intervened to prevent the Ottoman authorities from carrying out a forced relocation of Jewish settlers in Palestine, a policy that, given the recent genocide of the Armenians, could easily have ended in a similar bloodbath. This act, which saved the lives of thousands, is a pretty remarkable and complex layer to the man known as the Butcher of Verdun. Erich von Falkenhayn died in 1922, just 4 years after the end of the war he had done so much to shape. His legacy remains one of the most contested of the Great War. Was he the monstrous Butcher of Verdun? The man who coldly conceived of warfare as a simple, bloody arithmetic of death? Or was he a cold-eyed realist? One of the few commanders on either side that truly understood that the age of decisive Napoleonic battle was over, and that victory in this new total war would not go to the most brilliant general, but to the side that could endure the most suffering. I tend to be in the latter camp when it comes to Falkenhayn. It's one of the reasons why I wanted to do this short biographical podcast on him, because I think he is often misunderstood and misrepresented in history. And I found his memoirs to be really fascinating. As long as you take them with a grain of salt, as you do with anyone's memoirs, whether that be someone like General Grant or General Longstreet from the Civil War, or someone like Julius Caesar writing about his own wars. You know, everybody's going to write it in the way that makes them look the best and downplays their negative side. So I get that. And if you see his memoirs for what they are through that lens, I think it's a pretty good read, and it's worth checking out. Falkenhayn is a man whose career is a tragedy of mismatched talents and circumstances, I think. His greatest intellectual contribution, the theory of industrial attrition, led directly to his greatest disaster. His greatest practical success, the conquest of Romania, came only after he was stripped of the power to shape grand strategy. In the brutal calculus of the Great War, was Erich von Falkenhayn's grim vision of victory through exhaustion a monstrous aberration? Or was it simply the most honest and clear-sighted assessment of the horrific reality that all nations faced in the trenches of the Western Front? That's the question that we have to grapple with today. Thanks for listening.